Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Leaders Learning Live. This month's topic is change leadership. And so we've got a fantastic group of people from SUNY to engage in a conversation about this. And one of them is our fellow, Dr. Kirk Young. So thank you, Kirk, for carving time out of your busy schedule. Kirk serves as the Vice President for Student Affairs at Jamestown Community College, and he has been supporting the SAIL Institute for several years now with all of his leadership experience. And so today is a topic that I know he has been supporting the SUNY campuses with around change leadership for in different ways. But today will be an open discussion and a panel conversation. So we encourage you to ask your questions as well. So we'd like to keep this interactive. If you prefer to put things in the chat, I'll be monitoring that throughout the hour. Or if you'd like to raise your Zoom hand and unmute and engage with our panelists, that would be lovely as well. So as you know, all of these programs are recorded so that they are living resources for you and your colleagues. So you may not be leading a change initiative today, but maybe next year you're tapped and you want to go back to this as a resource. All of those programs, including today's, will be available on the SAIL YouTube channel. So let me share my screen for just a moment before I pass it over to Kirk and our panel. Let's see there. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. So as you know, Leaders Learning Live happens every month, and it's always on the third Thursday of the month from 12 to 1. We understand how busy you are, so if you are eating your lunch and multitasking, which we don't encourage, but you are more than welcome to do that and continue your learning journey and your leadership development. We have a full calendar for the rest of this calendar year. So next month, we'll be talking about building a transformative research culture. And November, we'll talk about mediation, which I always get a kick out of because I think about my Thanksgiving table, and mediation seems to be a relevant topic when you get all of the family together. And December, we'll be talking about community colleges, and we'll actually have Kirk back for that topic. He'll be talking about our hidden treasures, our community colleges across the system. So these programs, you just want to register in advance so that you have the Zoom link. But once you have that, you'll be able to log on right at noon and get your learning in. So our objectives for today's discussion: we want you to understand why leading change is a key leadership skill in today's higher ed environment, gain some awareness about some different approaches to leading change. There's lots of different ways you can tackle this. Obtain knowledge of skills to lead change through learning about successful change initiatives in higher ed. And we want you to learn how to use change leadership to effectively drive change in the work that you do for SUNY or beyond. So who do we have with us? I introduced Dr. Kirk Young, and he is joined by two of my colleagues at System Administration. So Jennifer Miller and I have worked very closely for a couple of years, and so really happy that she is a part of this conversation. I know she has a lot to offer with this topic. And we also have Bart Grasham. He's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management at System Administration. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Kirk. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Carolyn. It's great to be here with all of you today. This work that SAIL does is some amazing work. And I mean, we speak of the hidden treasures that exist throughout SUNY. I think SAIL at times can be considered one of those hidden treasures. And thanks to Carolyn for everything that she does. As she mentioned, I've been a fellow with the SAIL Institute now for many years and have enjoyed every minute of it. This topic of change leadership in higher education was something that I've been involved with, developing workshops and presenting material throughout SUNY. And as she was talking, my mind went back to one of the first that I did, and it was a presentation on change leadership and why it's important that we learn how to lead and manage change within higher education. And it was one I delivered at RIT, actually, a couple years before COVID. And it was interesting, all the things we were talking about there about, disruption and disruptive innovation and just how the foundations upon which higher education stands are crumbling, or are changing for sure, and how are we changing with them. And we really had a great and engaging conversation there at RIT. And then I've run into some of those colleagues or those individuals since then, and we referenced the conversations we had way back a few years before COVID, and then just how those things echoed in our minds as we were having to change so quickly and on the fly there throughout the pandemic. But anyway, today we have a wonderful opportunity to work with Jennifer and Bart. And thank you to the two of you for taking time to join us today. I've had the opportunity to work with both of you now for a number of years. And as I was putting together our panel, thinking of who we wanted to have share their insights and expertise with us about this topic of change leadership, the two of you came immediately to mind. And I'm glad it worked out that you two were able to make it here today. Bart, I know you recently had a position change, and so I'm glad that with your change in your role that you still were able to make this work, and so thank you. One quick housekeeping item, if you wouldn't mind, those of you that are here participating with us today, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself in the chat, if you could put your name there and where you're from and maybe what your role is, that would be helpful for us as we're going through this, just to kind of know who it is that we're speaking with. And as Carolyn mentioned earlier as well, I've come with some questions that we've developed around those learning objectives that we're prepared to speak about. But boy, if there are things that come to your minds while you're listening to this conversation, please don't hesitate to interrupt, raise your hand, type something in the chat. We definitely would love to hear from you and hear what's important to you. So with that, I do want to first give Jennifer an opportunity to introduce yourself and share with us why this is a topic that's, of interest to you. I know it is, and that's why I reached out to you. And then Jennifer, once you've done that, Bart, if you wouldn't mind doing the same.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Kirk. So yes, I'm happy to be with all of you today. I'm Jennifer Miller. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Community College Support at SUNY System Administration. I'm in the Office of Community Colleges and the Education Pipeline here at the system office. So I've worked, I think, with many of you, but some of you may, our paths have not crossed. So I'm glad to have fellow folks who are interested in change leadership to talk to today. It's definitely, as Kirk mentioned, an interest of mine. I've been at the system now 8 years and primarily in the community college sector, looking at how do we support some large scale statewide change projects within our community colleges and a few times with our state operated colleges. So I've had a couple of projects that I've worked on in the developmental education space, as well as some of our guided pathways work, which is for community colleges and organizational change efforts and related projects to those. So I've worked with many colleges on that, but also at different levels. So at the state level, obviously there's a lot of work that goes on at the college level, all of the levels that you all deal with at the college in general, but also in departments and in different areas. And then also at the national level, there's a lot of, and we'll talk about some of the factors impacting change in higher education, and the national stage is a big place for that. So anyway, in my work at SUNY, I've done quite a bit of this change leadership work, and it became kind of a passion project in supporting leaders doing this type of work. And we'll talk a little bit about leadership and management, because I think that's really important. Prior to SUNY, I was the Director of Communications at the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities. So I worked for the private college Association in New York State. And then I also worked for Cornell University. I was the Director of Business Partnerships for the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences there. And prior to that, I had a career in economic development before I came to higher ed, which is actually quite related in terms of the skill sets between economic development and higher education. So that's a little bit about my background. And here at System, I've also done a lot of work in coaching, both executive coaching and organizational change coaching that Carolyn mentioned earlier. So happy to talk about the role of coaching. Kirk's actually one of the coaches that's been through our coaching academy. So we have done a lot of work there to support college change efforts with folks that have an opportunity to help the college decide what information they have already and need to move an organizational change project forward. So that's a little bit about my background and my interest in this area. And I'm really excited to be with all of you today. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Bart.
Thank you. My name is Bart Gratian, and as Kirk mentioned, we have finally stopped counting in hours. I have been now the Associate Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management at SUNY System. Now this is my third week. A mere 2.5 weeks ago, I was the Vice president for enrollment management and student affairs at Rockland Community College, where I was there for a little over 2 years. And prior to that, I was in CUNY. I was in a similar position at LaGuardia Community College, and did a variety of things there for about 6-7 years. And before that, my higher education career was in public four-year institutions. So I took a hard left from public four-year institutions to private four-year institutions to public two-year institutions, and now to system where I'm excited to get started on some new work. Change leadership, change management has been to me, it's the centerpiece, because to me, change leadership is effective leadership. I don't think, and it's not a more effective, it's only effective if you know how to manage change. We have all encountered ineffective leaders because they are trying to hold the line in their current, whatever the current situation is. And we just know that that's just not going to work. It's a comfortable position, but it's a false comfort. So for me, especially with the work I've been doing around enrollment management for the past 25 years, you can't do enrollment management exactly the same way every year. You can try, but it's only gonna go down. So part of that is how do we do that? How do we manage that? How do we manage expectations around that? And how do we manage in the environment that we're in? Because again, if you're at a four-year public private institution, it's a very different kind of work environment. I see we had have a bunch of HR folks on the call today, which is great. And heavily unionized positions on the public sector. So it's a very different as far as that goes. So that's where my interest lies, is in how.
Thanks, Bart. We lost your volume there, lost your audio there just right at the very end, but I think you're back there with us. So thank you. Appreciate you taking time to introduce yourselves. It's great to have both of you here with us. And we'll go ahead and really jump into this topic of change leadership. One of the first thoughts that came to my mind as I was thinking about putting this together today is, when we think about, or a term that's often used when we're describing the workplace, whether it's in higher education or not, is this theme or topic of disruption. So things today are more unstable than they've ever been. That's no news to anybody here. And it seems that the common theme throughout everything that we do as leaders is the theme of complexity. This is certainly true in higher education. In order to be effective, leaders need to get comfortable with change and change management. Given that this is the case, why? So Jennifer and Bart, so given that this is the case, why, in your opinion, is the ability to lead change a core leadership skill today or in today's higher education environment?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, well, I know Bart talked a little bit about this just recently, so I want to add a little bit to what he had to say, because I think, the reality is that change is going to happen. It is whether we want it to happen or we don't want it to happen. In higher education, it's happening. And there are factors that are associated with that change. And we won't I'll try not to share a lot of researchers with you, but I think many of you, if you've worked in any of the change leadership or management work, the two of the really well-known folks that do work in this area are obviously John Cotter's leading change work in his book, and then also Adriana Kazar at USC, who's done a lot of work in how colleges change. And she talks about these factors driving change in higher education. So I think, we want to say, well, change is challenging. Yes, it absolutely is. And we can talk a little bit about how challenging it is. But if we try to ignore that it's going to happen, as Kirk said, it's a key leadership skill. It's going to happen. So it's better to prepare yourself at the project, departmental, college level, state level, and national level, so that you're better able to respond as higher ed professionals. And I'll just quickly talk about the 8 factors, or I'm not going to talk about them in depth, but just name the 8 factors that Kazar talks about as changing higher education. And it's the changing global economy. We're a global technology-driven economy, so technology is another factor. She mentions public investment in higher education and accountability. We see that often here in SUNY. Increasingly diverse students, that's definitely an area of forcing higher education to change in general. Being more corporate and operational minded in higher education. The for-profit education sector and some of the competition that we see, that's all driving change at all of our campuses. And knowledge about how people learn. Like for many years, we thought, at a certain point, people stop learning. We now know that that's not true in terms of how learning occurs in individuals. And then also internationalization of campuses and the impact of the global the ease of global economy and how we need to think about how our campuses manage that process or have students from other countries. So those are the 8 factors. Kazar, you may have others. We'd welcome other ideas in the chat of things, but I think that is going to force us as leaders to develop those skills. So I'll turn it to Bart to see what else he wants to share with that.
Absolutely. For me, the idea of disruption, to me, that's the negative spin on inclusion, right? A lot of the times what we're talking about when we're talking about disruption is how we're changing the things that we found comfortable to design, but that were not necessarily designed for the students we serve. So for me, I take a dim view of people who are trying to that want to fight against change a lot of time. Generally, I'm not a fan of change for the sake of change. I'm a fan of change with a purpose, change with intent. But to me, disruption is typically about how do we include more people in this conversation, whether it is how we're doing a thing on the campus or how we are, who we are serving and how we are serving them, and how intentional that is. So for me, that's kind of the driving thing. I have 4 kids in the house. All of them have special needs of some kind. All of them are completely different in every possible way. So when I started the parenting trip, it was, we're going to do things this way. And I learned very quickly that doing things this way was only going to work for me. I was not keeping in mind the needs of my kids and what they each individually needed. And that's just kind of where we're at now. It's about our employees, but it's also about our students and how we are serving them and who we are including in that conversation as we go. So is it disruptive to our comfort, or is it disruptive to the overall mission of the institution? If we want to avoid the disruption to the mission, but I think we can encourage disruption to comfort a lot.
Yeah, and I think, and as both of you have said, and as I mentioned as well, the environment we are in now is one that is highly impacted by change. And Jennifer, you mentioned many of the factors that are influencing change and so on. Yet I often find that within higher education, sometimes we're really, really resistant to change, or at least change happens really slowly. A thought that comes to mind, and Jennifer, you mentioned that one of the factors from Kazar is, the corporate kind of model that's starting to show up more and more in the work that we do here in higher education. I remember this, that factor came to mind for me as I was reading the biography of Jack Welch. I think it's titled "You Don't Know Jack." It was the name of the biography. But one of the quotes that Jack Welch was famous for saying, he said that when the rate of change outside your organization exceeds the rate of change inside your organization, the end is near. And obviously that, he was at GE, I believe, and, it was a very corporate and profit-driven world. And we're a little bit different than that, but I do remember just how much that statement resonated with me. Again, he said, when the rate of change external to your organization exceeds the rate of change within your organization, it's only a matter of time before the negative effects of that start to show up. And so what might be some of the risks to too heavily relying on the status quo or resisting change? What might be some of the risks to us as an institution, higher education, to us at the institutional level, each of us individually at our institutions, but then also within our role as leaders? So again, what might be some of those risks that come with resisting change or not developing at least that openness to change that we need? Bart, maybe we'll start with you this time and then look to Jennifer.
Yeah, I mean, in my roles around enrollment management, the risk to not changing is inherent, but at the same time, you will not see a more conservative, we have to do it the same way we did it last year group in the world than enrollment managers, just because their jobs are on the line, and there's a lot less immediate reward compared to the immediate risk of, if you try something new and it doesn't work and you don't land a class, that's it.
Yeah.
So it is a fraught proposition for a lot of folks, and that's why it has to be institutional. It has to be collaborative, because a lot of these things there is a risk involved, and if you are kind of out there on a limb by yourself, it has to be a pretty sturdy limb with some of this stuff. But the other thing, and just going back to the inclusion aspect, the other big risk with not doing it, to my mind, is we risk regressing to the mean. We risk going back to what a lot of our institutions were originally designed around, which was not inclusive. It was, very limited in scope as to who it expected to serve. And then, that the risk with not trying to stay on top of change is that you go backwards. There's no such thing as standing still. You're moving forward or you're moving backwards, one way or the other. So that's the biggest challenge, is how to measure the risk, and how to, when is it a justifiable risk versus kind of a wild guess. You want to make sure you've got foundations and things in place for it. But to me, that's always been the key, is how do we balance those two factors? Because you're never going to find complete stability standing still, but you have to look for the next step. You can't just jump all the time. So.
Yeah, so it's a more measured approach to change, and so forth. Jennifer, your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Bart had it for us in higher ed. I mean, it's an enrollment challenge, right? If you're not changing, your student populations are definitely, demographically, the odds are against us in New York State. Like, that's just where we're at. So we have to look to different populations of students to serve, and that's going to change our structures of our institutions a bit, because if you're serving some of the community colleges on this call, you're serving adult students, particularly in a particular way. That's going to be, if they are working and they are parents, they're going to have different needs than our traditional age students. So Bart talks about that. And actually, one of the change projects, the three of us have worked on together, as a strategic enrollment management project to help our community colleges gain some expertise in that area. But I also think, if you don't change, something's going to happen, right? Personally, for you and your work environment, if change is coming and you don't do that, either you can, in higher ed, we've been able to resist it more as groups of people. Like, we can kind of, so our complex structures allow us that for a little while, but at some point there's a breaking point, right? And I think some of us are seeing that with funding, like even taking outside of SUNY, Casanova College just closed, 6 months ago, 200-year-old college, private college in New York State. And, there's probably a bunch of factors, but the fact that needing to change with what our student population needs, as Bart said, and there's a great book, Becoming a Student Ready College by Tia McNair at AAC. And, there's really good reasons that if you don't change, things are going to happen. So whether it's at the personal level, it's at the departmental level, and the college level, and then at the state and national level. So, the idea is you can resist it for only so long, and then there are going to be trade-offs. And actually in higher ed, I say we, not collectively, I think change is a good thing in some cases, and important for our students, but, people can resist change. And that is a big challenge for some of the work you're all doing, is that it is a little easier than in a corporate environment that doesn't have unions or shared governance structures, or some more ways in which there's participation across the institutions. It's easier for corporations to decide a way to go. And so the other term that I think we need to think about is the ethics around the change, right? What is happening that is the pressure points, and is this the right change for our students and our institutions? So I think asking those questions as leaders is important. And also, hearing from those diverse voices that don't agree with the change. I think that's a really tough one, is that we decide we're going to do something, we think it's a good thing, and we just kind of go. And then we don't realize that how easily things can be derailed if you don't think about engaging audiences, which I think is something that this question you didn't ask that, Kirk, but I think that's really important as we go back to leadership skills. Is sometimes it's uncomfortable to ask people who disagree with you questions, but unfortunately, I think in some of the work I've seen, that's one of the best ways to understand where you're going to be with this change effort, no matter what the type of change it is. And that's another piece of all of it, is what type of change are you trying to do?
That's a Go
Kirk,
ahead.
can I add on to that real quick?
Go for it. Yeah.
I think she nailed an important point, bringing in the diversity of viewpoints. And I think I'm stepping on maybe a later question a little bit, but I just wanted to hit it while she's got it out there. The diversity of viewpoints part of the conversation, because especially on a large public institution, you've got a lot of constituent groups that have a lot of varying opinions and varying agendas and how that's going to play out with stuff. So it's critical that we have those conversations, but also that we don't let the naysayers drive the bus all the time. I have seen a lot of change management get derailed by, well, we know this group is going to say no, or this group is not going to like it, so we're just not even going to approach the topic. And that is where a lot of that's a lot of the grit in the gears when it comes to change management, is predetermining where you expect pockets of resistance, and then just stopping. And often I found that the pockets of resistance may materialize to some degree, but if you have a reasoned approach, that you can work through it. You can get, the collaboration that you're looking for. But I've seen way too many change management things just stop because they're afraid of that diversity of opinion conversation. They're afraid of the outreach on campus. Yeah. So I wanted to hit that since Jen had raised that.
Well, that is a great segue, both of you, into kind of next what we wanted to talk about, and that's specifically what might be some strategies or some efforts or approaches to leading change that you have seen to be effective. And Jennifer, you mentioned specifically, listening to those to the diverse voices, as you put it, Bart. And I think of, as you were talking, I think of one of the major risks to change management often is, we get stuck into a process of groupthink, sometimes where we're so wedded to change that sometimes we fall in line with decisions that may not be the best decision or the best strategy to move forward. And so what are things we can do to ensure that we don't fall into that pattern? And one of the things is to seek those diverse voices, to seek those that may see things a little bit differently, and to welcome that, to welcome that dialogue or that opportunity to talk through things. I was reading a book on leading change one time, and the advice or the skill that the author was advocating for was, sometimes when you're in a planning session, if you're running it, or if you're a president of an organization and you, or of a college, and you're there with your cabinet, you assign people at times to take the opposing viewpoint. Like, you may just have to sit there and say, okay, so and so and so and so, I want you now to take the opposing viewpoint. I want you to argue with me about, the idea that we're advocating for here. And I thought that was really insightful, that sometimes that might be an approach that will be important to take, especially when you're maybe considering high risk change or something like that, where you may be considering things and you might be missing key and important details. And in some cases, there may be people that are afraid to speak up, or they don't feel it's safe to speak up. And so if you as a leader can model by asking others, saying, I'm going to make it very safe for you to speak up, because I'm going to request that you do take the opposite approach, that may help others to be able to raise some concerns that they may have. So in leading change, and Jennifer, I've had the opportunity of benefiting from your change leadership. You mentioned a couple of the initiatives you've been a part of, the Strategic Enrollment Management Initiative, the Guided Pathways initiatives. You mentioned the coaching program and so forth. So I've benefited from your change leadership and so forth. So for both of you, what are some of the approaches that you have either employed yourselves or that you have seen that have been effective? So this, for our listeners, for those that are here with us today, that we're transitioning now into what are some practical things that you can take away from this experience today that may be helpful for you to seek to apply as you're leading change in your own purview. So anyway, I asked you specifically, Jen, but both of you, please feel free to share with us some specific approaches that you've seen or employed.
Well, let me just say thank you, Kirk. I did not expect him to say that, everyone. So there's been plenty of lessons learned from those change efforts, as well as Bart and I could both talk about, since Bart was also at Rockland and participated in the strategic enrollment management project that Kirk's talking about in particular. But, you know, from the perspective, I just want to talk about coaching for a second and getting some insight from folks that are sort of neutral to your project. So if you're faced with a departmental project, or you've got something on your plate coming up, one practical thing is finding someone that can ask you some questions about your process. And we never do this, right? We never have time for reflection and saying, before I launch into this change project, what is it that I really want to accomplish? What does leadership want me to accomplish if I'm managing the project? Like, I really feel, I know I'm saying this and you're all rolling your eyes because no one has time for pre-work on anything really, but I do think it helps as you move through the project. I will say that I think that spending a little time, having someone ask you some questions about your thinking around how you're going to organize your project, and I think that really helps. So that's like a coaching approach, right? You're asking open-ended questions and finding someone to partner with you to sort of think that through ahead of some of the resistance you will definitely run into, right? We're people. We are fear-based sometimes, and what we want changes can be frightening to people, and that you'll hear, like, you can throw all the data on a project and all the rationality at people and they'll still not want to do it, right? So we have to acknowledge that, but we also have to think about, as Kirk and Bart also said, is how do you pre-think through some of this? Some of this is just, I hate to say it, if we don't plan well, and I've been a victim of this in my own projects. I didn't plan well, and I really regret that. So sometimes just taking a few minutes to pre-plan some of this is going to save you a lot of work for whatever project you're undertaking, whether it's some of the statewide projects. There's times I wished I had thought a little bit sooner about certain things, and really had some of that. But the coaching perspective of having somebody in that you can trust to help you think through some of that, I think is really sort of a neutral party, and you have some of the answers. That's the coaching methodology, right? You're trying to uncover some of those things. So I think that's really important as you think about whatever change project you have. And I mean, we don't like reflection, but we only really kind of learn from sometimes thinking through that in past projects as well. So I'd start there, Kirk, is like, that's the beginning of some of these things. You get a project dropped on you, or you see a need for a change in your department or in your college. And then, you know, that leading change piece is around direction and vision. And then that managing change is more operational, right? So how are you getting the right players in the room? So all of that, having some early on thought process about how you manage that. And, you know, with the strategic enrollment management, I'm not, unlike Bart, I am not an expert in that area. But any good project manager of something, a change project, you find people. We had some consultants that knew this, and we listened to our colleges who are experts in this on how we should structure some of this. So, you know, some of that is you have to realize you may need help as a change leader or manager too. So I'll stop there and let Bart add on, but that's some of the learning. And it's been not because it's intuitive for me, it's because I've learned from some other efforts that haven't worked as well. As Bart and I talked about originally, like sometimes you learn best from those things that didn't work right, and you can build on that. So.
Yeah, I make sure to note all of the things that broke during the things that didn't go well. Like that, to me, that's the most important thing. And I mean, number one for me, right off the top, is there has to be a clearly defined why. Why are we here? What are we trying to solve? What is the change that we are trying to initiate? And does everybody understand the same why the same way from the start? Because a lot of times, you know, Jen said, you know, you see a thing that needs to change. Well, I may see a thing that needs to change, and Jen may also think it needs to change, but see it completely differently and see the change that needs to happen completely differently. So I think it needs to be very clear from the outset. The ones that I've been part of that were very successful had very specific outcome goals from the start. It wasn't like the collaborative and the groupthink aspect was not about what are we trying to do. It was about how are we trying to do the thing that has been identified as needing to be done. But that started with making sure everybody understood exactly why that was there and establishing that. That's another thing we skip a lot. We see a thing that we think needs to change, but then nobody actually verifies that. Nobody does the research to say the problem that we are trying to solve is actually the problem. So, you know, I'll give you an example, like just a concrete example. When I was at LaGuardia, we had an operational effectiveness project. And we combined it, so we were trying to build a framework to do institutional change management at the same time that we were doing a CUNY mandate on academic momentum. So we wanted to increase the number of students who completed 30 credits in their first year. And we had a very specific percentage target. Like these were there were very specific things that we were trying to aim for. But the operational effectiveness piece was, how do we get there? But the first 6 weeks of that project was identifying and doing research on the actual problem. Everybody thought they knew why students didn't complete 30 credits in their first year. And everybody had their own very, very certain reason for that. And almost all of us were wrong. I went in there saying we need to change how we cancel classes. We do it, the way we do it, it messes up the schedule. Nope, that wasn't the problem. People came in with a list of things, that wasn't the problem. We boiled it down to two things that nobody was looking at when we started the project, which was nobody talked about completing 30 credits in a year, ever. We talked about full time, which was 12 credits at a time or 24 credits in a year. Nobody ever talked about 15 and 30 in any conversations. That was number one. And number two, it was virtually impossible to schedule 15 credits at a time the way we had set up our schedule.
Yeah.
There was so many conflicts inherent in the system that a student they would get to 12 credits and quit because they were already in there for an hour trying to get to 12 credits. They were done. They weren't trying to add any more credits. So that was what we focused on to fix it. But we identified the why up front. Like, what are we here for? This is the purpose. We identified the basis of the problem, and then we worked on the solutions to the problem. And that was the change made. And like who was in the room was critical. Like we did everything that Jen was talking about in terms of, we had people in there that we knew would want to change the thing. We had people in there who said it was always the student's fault and it couldn't possibly be the institution. We had people in there who had no vested interest in this whatsoever from their positional aspect, so that we could have that conversation. But the real success of it, I think, was based in the defining the why and then establishing the actual problem behind that, rather than guessing and then putting a problem out there and then never following up on it. We also had all kinds of metrics to chase it down on the back end. So those were some like very concrete things that I found very helpful in this kind of work that are both often absent in the conversation.
Absolutely. I think that the quote comes to mind. I don't even know if it's an actual real quote. It's attributed to Einstein, that he was once asked or he once made the statement that if I was given a challenge or something to work through or to try to develop a plan to overcome, I would spend 90% of the time defining the problem, and then 10% of the time actually developing, an approach, solution, and implementation.
Yep.
And again, I'm not quite sure if he really did say that or not, but I do agree with the logic behind all of that. And so thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Bart, for sharing that specific experience. Jennifer, I'd like to hear from you. If you could share with us a time when you saw or were involved with like an actual experience. And I mentioned effective leadership when we were talking before. You can define that however you want. Or effective change, I think, is what I was talking about. And feel free to define that however you want. But yeah, help us learn, Jennifer, from your experience, what an effective change management or leadership experience might look like.
So I agree completely with Bart. The why is so very important in anything, whether it's at the campus level, department level, whatever you're doing on campus. At the state level, it's the same. Most of the projects I've worked on in the last 8 years are how do we support colleges. Many of them have been funded by foundations, right? So we have those factors that the research is out there. We have researchers across the country that are studying higher education effectiveness and what's good for students. And then we try to make some of those changes, because sometimes when you're working, I know all of you are working really hard for your students at the student level. And remember when I was teaching in a community college, like I really cared about my students, like I really wanted them to succeed. But sometimes you don't know that even though you're passionate about helping them succeed, like Bart said, we aren't uncovering the real challenge, right? We aren't identifying the why, or we look at things as technical challenges, right? That they're easy to solve. If we just know how to do it, we use rationality and we'll solve it. but really it's all adaptive, right? Like there's emotion involved, there's people's opinions and feelings and all of this stuff we try to say doesn't exist in the workplace, which it really does, right? We try to say everybody works on data and rationality, and we know that that's really not true. So I would say that, you know, at the state level, what I've noticed when we're trying to get everybody together, moving in a direction, right, that a lot of the projects I worked on were opt-in. So the president opted into the project for the college, and then they assign this poor person at mid-level, and some of you I've worked with, Kirk and Bart, happen to be that poor person assigned, actually at a higher level, these gentlemen, but is that, you know, a person gets assigned the project and they have a million other things they're doing. And so what I've noticed is the need for support, right, from the highest levels. If it's going to be top down, which some of this stuff is, let's be real, like in some of your cases, you're getting assigned a change project and you have to implement it, right? So some of the times what I see what's most successful, and Bart talked about this a little bit, is the ability to bring in the right people to the table. I mean, first and foremost, and if you don't know, finding others to help you figure out who those people are, because at the end of the day, you know, you can, you know, the projects that have like a champion that's so strong that brings no one in doesn't really do well, at least from the viewpoint I sit at. The person that can bring in a couple of key advisors and help support engagement from a large group of people that can make the change. And then we're talking about actually starting the change, but then there's the whole sort of the implementation of change and then sustainability of change. Like we haven't even, like we'd need another hour, Carolyn, for that. But ultimately, it's the people who are leading this work that are assigned. You have to have, as Kurt was saying, I think, commitment to, and Bart was saying, you have to have somebody that kind of can see all these pieces and help bring them together. And, you know, that some of that skill we just don't always have. We have to sort of talk about it and learn from each other and build it. So I would say that's a huge important piece as I look at, you know, some of the state change projects and when they've succeeded and when they haven't. But I will say at the end of the day, leading up is important. So if you're in that mid-level and you're managing, you've got to get senior leadership engaged or else it can fall apart there. Or if you're senior leadership or you're at the VP or higher president level, you have to turn it over to let people do the work, but support those folks. So, you know, in particular, the presidents and I'm not going to call one person out over another, but I'll just say in general, the projects that I've seen most successful have that senior leadership support that's real, that's not like a rubber stamp, that they're engaged in, that the people leading the change can come to them and help support that. That's when it's most effective, right? But the change can come from anywhere. As Bart said, the why can bubble up from anywhere. You all have influence in your places, and that's where higher ed is complex, because change can happen more than just top down. So I would say, you know, as I look, I don't want to call out one college over another, but in general, those are some of the things as I look across a bunch of different projects. The other thing I'll say in higher ed and SUNY in particular, you know, shared governance and union engagement is really important. You know, our unions and our shared governance bodies are strong. And if you're going to do a change project that, you know, even some of the operational projects rub up against this, you want to make sure those folks are at the table, because you know, you're not going to necessarily get as far as you'd like unless you have some of that understanding, and to ignore it is at the peril of the project. So as I think of effectiveness, those are some of the areas that I would say in particular, you know, we could talk a lot about conceptual, but in particular, those are areas I think I've seen change projects really be effective, and things just fall apart. And having somebody that is really dedicated to it helps, but those people get tired. So having the team concept can really keep it moving beyond that one person.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing those insights and from your experience and the things that you've witnessed and experienced going through change and so forth. Maybe a quick little commercial break. Jennifer, you've referenced a few times, in fact, you mentioned in the very beginning a couple of resources. You mentioned the book Leading Change by John Cotter, and then you also mentioned Kezar's work as well. And I'm a big fan of both of those. You know, the Cotter and his 8-step model is something that I have turned to often as I have been involved in trying to lead change at my institution. And many of the things you've referenced, both of you, you know, defining the problem and making sure that you have kind of a guiding coalition, the senior leadership is involved, and so on and so forth, are things that that Cotter does a really good job of explaining. And so along those, and I highly recommend their books to any of you that are participating today. I mean, if you really want to get a handle on how to make change happen at your institution, look to both of those resources. And along those lines, Jennifer has provided us with a couple of resources that we will be sharing with you. We've sent them on to Carolyn, and Carolyn has those, and we'll send these resources on to you after we finish today. But Jennifer, do you want to take a minute and just explain what those resources are, and so that as people receive that email with those resources, they'll kind of know what they're there for.
Thanks, Kirk. And we definitely, this has been, we wanted this to be active. So if you have questions for us too, or insights that you've had that you want to share with this group, please share those. But Kirk, just thanks for that. Yeah, so we're in higher education, right? So in some ways, we can just go by our gut and instinct, and we should in some areas, but there is a lot of resources out there for us that maybe could be valuable. So, there is a balance between studying this, which I've taken on in some of the work that I've done in terms of studying it as a topic, organizational change and leadership in that. And the practical aspect, Cotter does really well. As Kirk said, many of you maybe have already read his work. He has a ebook that Carolyn will send out that's new and free, that puts, the Leading Change book originally was, I think, 2012. So it's been, we've been through a pandemic, right? Change is even harder now in terms of some of the things that we've been through as a society. But I would say that's a book. And then Aleutian had some of Kazar's work and some things they think about from a technology change leadership perspective. They add a couple models to that. That's a free resource that Carolyn can send out. And then finally, the Cotter template. I think it was EDUCAUSE that put this together. It's a Word document that it has the template and allows you to work through a change project yourself. Because I think that's really important. Like, we can read all of this, but if we don't have a tool to help us think through it, it makes it very abstract. And, in an academic exercise, we don't want that. We want something that's viable. So Carolyn will share that Word template. You can use it. It gives you an example. It's a technology focused example. It came from EDUCAUSE, but you can see where you can add those steps in. And then I would just suggest there's a video that also I think we'll share that Kazar did at the I think it's the University of West Virginia or West Virginia University, one of those places that's going through, I don't know if you all are reading Inside Higher Ed, a lot of change right now in terms of what's going on there. She spoke about some of the leadership traits and characteristics and approaches to change from a higher education perspective, which Cotter does not get into, because higher education, as we mentioned many times, is very different. And then she also talked about one other concept I'd really love just to hit on, which is sometimes it doesn't work. And Bart and I were joking about this at the beginning. Sometimes it doesn't work, and that there's for reasons, and maybe there are good reasons, but sometimes you have the wrong influencers involved, and changing who's involved can really help you move that forward. And sometimes you just, it shouldn't stop the work, right? As we talked about, but maybe it has to change and evolve and be a different format of the work. And I would say that that's an area we don't often think about, right? We think we just failed at it, but maybe if we're not communicating, which is another piece we didn't get into today, is the constant need to communicate about what that, once you have the why, as Bart said, and the people on board, that communication structure is there, and that you keep, and the management and leadership support, you keep communicating, because people don't remember, we're busy, we're inundated. So I would just say that. So those are 4 resources we'll share with you that are really important. And then there's also a change leadership community of practice around the digital learning environment. So anybody that's working in the new DLE that we're doing across SUNY, I'll put my email in the chat, and they're interested in that kind of concept. There's a group that's getting together on Brightspace. So there's lots of things. I know Carolyn's thinking about some more resources to support particularly leading change in the SAIL environment. So there's a lot out there, but it's also, figuring out what's valuable for you at the time and what you need to do. So I'll just stop there. Is that what you were looking for, Kirk? Like,
absolutely.
That's my commercial for resources to support you.
Thank you. Yeah, Bart, you've got a comment.
I just want, Jen mentioned something I think that's critically important. Sometimes it doesn't work, and it's not, and it may be the people in the room, but it also may be that the underlying assumption was incorrect or simply changed. Because again, we're in a constantly evolving environment. One of you mentioned Jack Welch's quote that stuck with you and just kind of embedded itself. And one of those things for me has always been the sunk cost fallacy. It's a term from economics for those who aren't familiar. It's basically throwing good money after bad. We do this all the time in higher education. We will go through a process and then we will just, even if it's crashing and burning, we will just keep going with it because we have made the change. I think one of the critical steps of this thing is, do you have good metrics in place before you get started that you're going to measure, so you know where they go? One of the you see this all the time, right? We determine what metrics we're going to measure after the thing is already in place, so we can make sure it's working. But we don't put the metrics that we want to measure in place before we put the change in place, so that we know if it's working. And that's huge difference, because then if we ride these things into the ground, which we do all the time, you're just throwing good money after bad at that point. You have to, it's a lot of work and you put a lot of time into these things, but part of it is kind of divesting emotionally from some of it at some point and saying, if the metrics aren't there, the things we had all agreed on to check at the beginning, if it's not working, then we need to continue to evolve the process. It's not throw it out. It's not that year is gone. It is, we learned what didn't work, which is just as important as learning what does work.
Right.
Now we're going to build on that. We're going to steer in a slightly different direction, or maybe an entirely different direction based on what we've learned from that process.
Bart, I would just add that I think that's right on, but I would also add with metrics, it's qualitative and quantitative. Like, it's not just the quant, right? Like, the quant numbers are great, but if we can't analyze what those numbers are actually saying, some numbers are really easy, right? Graduation rates, it's pretty easy seeing that. But if you're trying to do change projects, getting to what so that the tough thing in higher ed, and any researcher will tell you this, is really getting to what is the lever that's driving that change, right? And there's so many things going on, like, sussing out to that very specific thing, what that one item is very challenging. So as a plug for some qualitative research, you need to talk to students, talk to folks involved in the process, and see what their experience has been. And sometimes, as Bart said, that leads to what what it should move to as a feedback loop, right? Continuous feedback is important. None of this is a one and done. This is a constant thing. If you want a one and done, I don't think we're in the right business for that. Higher ed is a continuous change, right? We're going through that. Learning should be something we're all very interested in, since that's the business we're in. But I would say we have to be careful that when we look at those metrics Bart's talking about, we're very careful not making huge deliberations based on one slice of it if we can't really truly map, right? So there's some things out there that are easy, that have been validated. There are some things that haven't been, but you don't necessarily want to throw it out if you have to wait to see if that validation happens. Sometimes it takes a while. So I would say, qualitative is important as well as quantitative in data and metrics. But I agree, setting it after doesn't help us. And many of us have done that. Like, I've done that with projects. Like, you're like, okay, well, I have these deliverables. Well, what's the actual metric that we're trying, or the outcome, even if you don't like the word metric, outcome of that, because that helps with the qualitative. So I just wanted to add that part, because I think it's a really
absolutely
amazing.
And the metrics have to be good metrics. It's not, they have to be realistic metrics. You have to manage those expectations to some degree, and they have to add up to a collective goal at the end. It can't just be, we're going to make enrollment higher or graduation better. Like that, those aren't metrics. And that often we see those kinds of things, or some crazy, we're going to raise enrollment by 38%. Like, no, you're not. Stop it. So.
Thank you both. Very, very important points. I do now, as we're kind of coming toward the end of our time, I do want to invite anybody that's here with us. Are there any questions that come to mind as you're listening to this conversation, or any comments that you'd like to share with us? I'd like to give you an opportunity to speak up, or maybe put something in the chat.
While we're waiting, Kathleen just put in the HIFIS work on adaptive leadership and the systems work of social change relevant to higher ed. I think that's really true. That's, I mentioned earlier, the technical versus adaptive challenges you have with change. That book, I think, is what she's making note of. And it's really important to think, like, what kind of change is this? Is it a technical change? Is it an easy change? Or is it an adaptive change? And then, like, some of the things that we've all talked about are really important to that. So really identifying something that's simpler, that doesn't need as many steps, and to something that's more adaptive, and it's going to be impacting more folks emotionally, or in the the social part of what we're doing. So I think thank you, Kathleen, for putting that in there. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, thank you. I was writing that down as you were talking. That is a resource I am not familiar with. And so gotten something out of our session today. I appreciate that.
HIFAS has done a lot of work in the Harvard Business Review too. A lot of the change work comes from the Harvard Business Review. So business leads in some of this.
Yeah. Please, and just the last few minutes, please, share with us any closing remarks or thoughts that you've got.
Just for the HR people in the room, because I know I saw a bunch of HR titles in the initial introductions, because I think this will speak to them. One thing we haven't talked about and is critical, especially in the large public institution settings with heavily unionized environments and those kinds of things, is understanding what you can and should ask of people. We have a real issue with, we're going to build these expectations on a foundation of, this group will do X, when there's absolutely nothing in place that will establish that that group can or should or is going to get paid to do X.
Right.
So part of it, part of change management is really understanding the parameters of your environment and who you're asking to do what. If you're building it on, if it's too hopeful and aspirational, so much so that it's going to result in grievances, then you're doing it wrong. Like that's a critical point. But we do that all the time. We build these things on kind of assumptions that people will do things for the good of the college or the good of the student, but we're not doing anything to make sure that that's possible or can be held to account.
Yeah.
So just wanted to throw that in there because I knew we had some HR folks in the room.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bart, for sharing that. Jennifer, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Bart's point is a really good one. Is also I think underscoring again, your abilities. We talked about skill building to both lead and manage change. Not sometimes those you may be able to better be a change manager than a change leader, and that's okay. Maybe you can do both really well. But I think it's really doing some self-identification. You're all here today to kind of think through these concepts with us, but really thinking about that, because the activities around managing the change versus leading the change, they are different, right? They're not completely, and sometimes we put those terms together, and even Cotter says we have to pull them apart because there are different operational skills needed for those things, and some people do both well and some people do one or the other really well. So I think it's just incumbent upon us as people who are interested in this, because we're here at this session today, to think through that personally for ourselves and build skills where you really want them for your career and your support of your students in your departments and colleges. So that would be my final sort of thought on change, and keep learning about it, right? Like there's so much out there that we continuously learn and change. And like Bart said earlier, and I know Kirk's been through this too, you learn from the things that don't go well. So take time to reflect and understand that's part of the learning and the continuous improvement journey that we're all on. I mean, it feels bad to fail sometimes, but I think failure, business uses it, fail forward, right? It's like learning from that and trying to change that for the future is really important, I think, as a skill as we are continuously thinking about change in higher ed.
That's wonderful. I don't know how an hour has gone by so quickly. I appreciate both of you very much sharing your experience and your expertise with us. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And thank you everybody that's attended, that has shared some insights and maybe your experiences in the chat. We appreciate you being here with us. Those that watch it on the recording in the future, thank you. With that, I'll toss it back to you, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Jennifer and Bart. What a great hour. And we can see the compliments and the gratitude rolling in the chat as well. So really appreciate you sharing your expertise and look forward to re-engaging with all of you next month, the third Thursday of the month from noon to 1. We'll be talking about transformative research and have a great panel already assembled for that discussion. So if there are more topics that you're interested in, by now we have likely covered it. And so I encourage you to check out the SAIL YouTube channel. You'll also get, if you registered for today's program, you'll get the follow-up email with the list of all the resources. And so thanks again to Jennifer for sharing all of that with us. I put a link to a survey in the chat as well. So if you have just 1 minute, Please let us know what you thought. If you have ideas for future topics for these programs, we always read those feedback surveys, and we use what you need in order to build programs that will really support you to get there. So thank you for taking time to do that, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.